John Spencer was the epitome of professional success. As the owner of a network of innovative companies, he had everything most people dreamed of: luxury cars, a panoramic view apartment in downtown Chicago, and an enviable bank account. Yet, none of these achievements could fill the growing void within him. At 38, he was still single and deeply disenchanted with love. Since his youth, John had believed that true fulfillment came from building a strong family, something he never experienced during his childhood. Raised by absentee parents, he longed for a wife who genuinely loved him and a home filled with the laughter of children. However, his romantic experiences had been limited to relationships with women who saw him only as a ticket to a life of luxury. John often declined invitations to social events, preferring to spend solitary evenings in his luxurious penthouse. The dazzling lights of Chicago seemed to mock his introspection, reminding him that amidst such a vibrant city, he still felt profoundly alone. Despite his confident demeanor in the workplace, John was a man tormented by doubts in his personal life. Countless nights were spent staring at the ceiling, questioning whether it was even possible to find someone who would love him for who he was, not for what he had. His loneliness consumed him slowly, and his only escape was immersing himself in work, where he felt he still had control. It was a cloudy morning in Chicago. John Spencer, impeccably dressed in his custom-tailored suit, was on his way to work. His routine was always the same: a quick coffee, a few text messages answered on his phone, and waiting for his driver to take him to the office. But that day, something unusual happened. As he walked toward the car parked in front of his building, he noticed a young girl standing on the sidewalk. She was small, dressed in tattered clothes, with a determined look that contrasted with her fragile appearance. Her disheveled hair was hastily tied into a braid, and she clutched a worn-out ukulele in her hands. It seemed like she had been there for a while, but John, in his usual rush, assumed she was just another street kid. As he opened the car door to get in, the girl suddenly ran toward him. "Wait," she called out, breathless. John frowned, confused and slightly wary. "You can't get in that car." Her words spilled out quickly, almost stumbling over themselves, but they carried an urgency that made John stop immediately. Startled by her boldness, he glanced around, searching for some explanation. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his voice steady but betraying a hint of unease. The girl, undeterred, stepped closer, her gaze intense and unwavering. "I need to talk to you. It's important. Please, don't get in the car right now." John, unsettled, took a step back. There was something in her tone that he couldn't ignore. A chill ran down his spine, as if something monumental was about to alter the course of his life. Hesitant, he obeyed the girl's plea and closed the car door. "All right," he said, trying to keep his composure. "What's going on?" She glanced around nervously, as if ensuring no one was listening. Then, she leaned in and whispered something into his ear. The moment the words reached him, John felt his body weaken. His vision darkened for a few seconds, and he had to sit on the nearest park bench to avoid fainting. The girl stood beside him, watching him with a mix of concern and determination. While John tried to catch his breath and organize his thoughts, the girl remained silent. He looked at her again, struggling to process what she had just said. His hands trembled, and his heart raced uncontrollably. Deep inside, he knew this encounter would change everything. As he sat on the park bench, still reeling from the girl's words, memories of a past he thought he had buried began to resurface. His already racing heart now ached for a different reason, the reminder of who he used to be before becoming the successful businessman he was today. Years ago, John had been a troubled young man. Growing up in a poor neighborhood in Denver, he had a quick temper and a tendency to get involved in unnecessary fights. His parents, always absent, never noticed how much he longed for guidance. Left to navigate life on his own, he found solace in the streets, expressing his anger at the world. He frequently ended up at the police station for minor offenses like vandalism or street fights. To most people, he was just another kid with no future. But not everything in his life had been darkness. At the age of 20, John's life began to shift when he met Laura, a young woman with a sweet smile and eyes full of dreams. She was unlike anyone he had ever encountered. Laura believed in second chances and, against all odds, saw something in John that no one else did: potential. He would never forget the day they met. It was a summer afternoon, and he was sitting on the steps of a closed store, his fists still bruised from a recent fight. Laura, carrying a book, walked by and stopped. Without hesitation, she approached him and asked, "Are you okay?" It was a simple question, but it came from someone who genuinely seemed to care. Suspicious, John responded harshly, but Laura didn't give up. Her persistence disarmed him, and soon they were talking. Laura came from a humble family, but she possessed an inner strength that captivated John. She believed in the power of change and encouraged him to be better. "You're not defined by what you've done so far, but by what you'll do from now on," she often said. And he believed her. Because of Laura, John began to distance himself from bad influences and the troubles that had followed him for so long. He found a simple job at an auto repair shop, determined to prove he could be someone Laura would be proud of. In the moments they spent together, he felt he was finally beginning to find the purpose he had been searching for. He remembered one day in particular when Laura showed up at the auto shop with a lunchbox she had prepared herself. "I know you're trying, John. And I want you to know I'm here for you," she said as she handed him the package. It was a simple gesture, but to him, it felt like a promise that he wasn't alone in his journey to become a better person. Sitting on the park bench, John closed his eyes for a moment, letting the memories flood his mind. He recalled the genuine joy he felt when he was with Laura and how she believed in him, even when he couldn't believe in himself. These memories were a bittersweet contrast to the man he had become, someone with success but without love. Over time, John and Laura became inseparable. To him, Laura was like a beacon in the storm, a steady presence that gave him the strength to continue his transformation. To her, John was living proof that with love and support, even the most lost soul could find its way. The couple began to dream together, mapping out plans for a future where they could leave the shadows of the past behind. They spent hours in a small city park, sitting on a bench under the shade of an oak tree, talking about what life might be like if they moved to a bigger place, like New York or Chicago. John wanted to give Laura a better life than she had known, and Laura dreamed of exploring the world by his side, far from the gossip and judgment of their small community. One evening, as they walked through the town square, Laura shared her concern. "I want to go with you, John, but I can't stop thinking about my grandmother. She's all I have left, and I don't know if I can leave her behind." Laura's grandmother, Mrs. Margareth, was a strong-spirited woman, but her health had begun to decline. Laura had been caring for her ever since her parents passed away in a car accident. John stopped and took Laura's hands firmly. "Laura, we'll figure it out. We can find a place to live, start our lives, and then come back for your grandmother. She can live with us. I would never ask you to leave her behind for good." Laura's eyes filled with tears, and she nodded. It was moments like this when she truly felt the depth of John's love. He wasn't just thinking about their future, he was also considering how to keep her connected to her roots. Not everyone, however, shared the couple's optimism. Mrs. Margareth, noticing that her granddaughter was seriously considering moving with John, called her for a conversation. "You're young, my dear, and you're in love. But love can be blind. John has a good heart, but he's still learning to be a responsible man. I'm afraid he might hurt you, even if he doesn't mean to." Margareth made it clear she wouldn't oppose Laura's decision, but her words echoed in Laura's mind, planting a seed of doubt. Despite this, Laura chose to trust John and their plans. Together, they began saving for the move, cutting out luxuries and working extra hours whenever they could. On nights when they were exhausted, they would daydream, envisioning the small apartment they would have and the new adventures they would embark on. It was a sunny Sunday, and John and Laura decided to spend the day together before diving into another week of work and strict saving for their plans. They chose the nearby woods, a quiet place where they could dream in peace, away from daily worries and the opinions of others. Carrying a picnic basket prepared by Laura, they walked hand in hand, laughing and exchanging affectionate touches as the sounds of nature filled the air. They found a clearing near a stream, spread out a blanket, and began their picnic. Laura brought along her notebook, where she scribbled ideas and thoughts, while John watched her with a love-struck smile. Picking a nearby flower, he gently tucked it into Laura's hair. "You know, it doesn't matter where we go, as long as I'm with you," he said. Laura smiled back, but her eyes betrayed the lingering concern she felt about leaving Mrs. Margareth behind. After finishing their meal, they decided to explore the stream. Nearby, they discovered a small rowboat, seemingly left behind by someone. The idea of a ride on the river was too tempting to resist. Laughing and teasing each other, they climbed into the boat and set off, excited for the adventure. John rowed while Laura pointed out the small birds darting across the sky. Everything felt perfect. But then, the sky began to darken. A sudden gust of wind rippled through the air, stirring the waters of the river. "I think we should head back," John said, his tone laced with worry. Laura agreed, gripping the edge of the boat as he tried to steer them back to the shore. However, the current grew stronger, making it increasingly difficult to control the boat. The sound of distant thunder echoed ominously, and soon the first drops of rain began to fall. What started as a light drizzle quickly turned into a full-blown storm. The boat rocked violently as John struggled to keep it steady. "Hold on," he shouted to Laura, who clung to the side, trying to maintain her balance. Before they could react, a powerful wave slammed into the boat, flipping it over. Both were thrown into the water, carried away by the relentless current. John swam with all his strength, desperately trying to spot Laura in the chaos of the storm. He called her name repeatedly, but the rain and wind drowned out his voice. Panic gripped his heart as he realized he couldn't reach her. After an exhausting struggle against the raging waters, John was finally swept onto the riverbank, gasping for air. Two fishermen, who had taken shelter nearby, found him and called the rescue team. At the hospital, John kept asking about Laura, but no one had any answers. "She has to be alive," he repeated over and over, tears streaming down his face. The silence from the doctors and rescuers only deepened his despair. The days following the accident were the longest and most painful of John's life. He remained hospitalized for 2 days, recovering from minor injuries and exhaustion caused by his fight against the current. Yet, it wasn't his physical state that tormented him the most, it was the crushing weight of uncertainty. Laura had yet to be found, and each passing minute without news was pure agony. He couldn't forget those last moments in the river, her wide, terrified eyes as the water's force carried her away. Her words before the boat capsized echoed endlessly in his mind, "No matter what happens, I'll always love you." The emptiness left by her absence seemed to grow with each passing hour. After being discharged from the hospital, John wasted no time and went straight to Mrs. Margaretha's house. She opened the door with a cold, heavy expression. Dressed in black, her face was lined with grief. When she saw him approach, she took a step back as though his presence was unbearable. "Why did you come here?" "To confirm what you've done. To witness the ruin you've brought to my family." Her words cut through him like knives. John froze, unable to respond. "She's gone, John. My granddaughter, my Laura. She died because of you. If it weren't for you, she'd still be here with me, alive." The shock of her words was more devastating than any physical pain he had ever endured. John tried to speak, but his voice was weak. "That can't be true. No. She can't be gone. We had plans." Margaret, her eyes filled with tears and rage, pointed toward the road. "Get out of here, John. I never want to see you again. Take your guilt with you because that's all that's left." With no strength to argue, John turned and began walking away, the sound of Laura's grandmother's sobs echoing behind him. Each step felt heavier than the last, but he knew there was no place for him there anymore. The pain of loss, combined with the crushing weight of guilt, seemed to shatter his soul. He didn't look back. That same night, John decided he had to leave. He couldn't stay in a town where every corner carried a memory of Laura, where every face seemed to judge him for something he couldn't prevent. Packing only a few clothes and with no clear plan, he left everything behind, carrying only the broken promise of a future that would never come. As John departed, drowning in his grief, Mrs. Margaret closed the door and leaned against it, gasping for air. The anger on her face slowly gave way to something darker, a look of regret and guilt. She knew she had lied. Laura wasn't dead, but deep down, Margaret believed she was protecting her granddaughter from even greater pain. After the accident, Laura had been found miles downriver by local fishermen. She was unconscious but alive. They brought her to a hospital in a neighboring town, where she spent days recovering. When she finally woke, her first thought was of John. "Is he okay? Where is he?" she asked weakly. Mrs. Margaret was at her bedside, holding her hand. Her granddaughter still looked so fragile, and in that moment, a thought consumed Margaretha's mind: perhaps it would be better for Laura to believe John was dead. After all, she was certain John could never provide the stability Laura deserved. With a heavy heart, Margaret looked into Laura's confused eyes and lied. "I'm so sorry, my dear, but John. He didn't survive. He was taken by the current, just like you. They only found you." Laura, stunned, remained silent for a few seconds before tears began to fall. She turned to her side, curling up like a frightened child. "This can't be true. We were going to be together. He promised me." Margaret tried to comfort her, but she knew Laura's pain was too deep to be soothed by words. In the days that followed, Laura cried softly when she thought no one was watching. Even as her physical strength returned, her soul seemed shattered. A few days later, a new reality emerged. Laura discovered she was pregnant. The news brought conflicting emotions. On one hand, the idea of carrying a part of John within her gave her comfort. On the other, she knew she would have to face the world alone. She decided not to tell her grandmother, fearing Margaret might convince her to give up the child. As time passed, Margaretha's health declined rapidly. The guilt over what she had done to both John and Laura ate away at her conscience. In her final moments, she called Laura and tried to say something, but her words were interrupted by weakness. "I only wanted to protect you." And then she was gone, leaving Laura to face the future alone. With Margaretha's death, Laura felt the weight of being completely alone in the world. Now pregnant and still mourning John, she had to make a decision: stay in the small town full of painful memories or seek a fresh start for herself and her child. She chose the latter, convinced that a new life could only be built far away from the past. After selling her grandmother's few belongings, Laura used the money to move to a smaller town in rural Ohio. It was a quiet place with modest houses and tree-lined streets, far from the prying eyes and gossip of her old neighborhood. She rented a small apartment on the second floor of an old house, with a single bedroom that would serve for both her and the baby. It wasn't luxurious, but it was enough to begin anew. Determined to secure a future for her child, Laura took any job she could find. She started as a waitress at a local diner, working long hours with a forced smile that masked her exhaustion and sorrow. As her belly grew, customers were often kind, sometimes leaving generous tips out of admiration for her determination. In her rare moments of rest, Laura would sit by the window of her tiny apartment, sewing small items for the baby. She did this not only to save money but because it kept her connected to a sense of hope. Each stitch was a reminder that, despite the hardships, her child represented a new beginning. The birth of Emily was both the hardest and happiest day of Laura's life. After hours of labor, she finally held in her arms a bright-eyed little girl who brought her to tears of joy. In that moment, Laura made a silent promise: she would do everything in her power to protect her daughter and ensure she had a better life, even if it meant sacrificing her own happiness. Raising Emily alone was far from easy. Laura worked 2 jobs and often barely saw her daughter while she was awake. Even as a small child, Emily understood her mother's absence and forgave it. She saw Laura's efforts and, in her young heart, admired the strength of the woman who was raising her. On the rare occasions they had time together, Laura would read stories to Emily and sing songs her own mother had taught her. Although Laura tried to hide it, there were nights when she cried herself to sleep, alone in her room. She often wondered how her life might have been if John were still by her side. But then she would look at Emily and feel that, in some way, John was present in their daughter. Emily's smile, so much like his, was both a comfort and a painful reminder of what would never be. Emily grew up in modest surroundings but with a curious spirit and a sensitive soul. From a young age, she loved exploring the streets of their small town. Whenever she had free time, especially when her mother was at work, she would venture out with her little ukulele, a second-hand gift Laura had saved up for weeks to buy. To Emily, the ukulele was more than an instrument. It was a companion and an outlet for her emotions. She often chose quiet spots, like park benches or the edge of the town's lake, to sit and play. Over time, people began to notice her, this small girl with delicate fingers creating simple but captivating melodies. Some left coins or little gifts like flowers and sweets beside her, charmed by her talent and sweetness. Emily, however, didn't play for money. She played because it made her feel free. Despite her apparent joy, Emily understood more about the world than her age suggested. She noticed how her mother came home late at night, exhausted but always smiling for her. "Did you eat well today?" Laura would ask, even though she often didn't have the energy to prepare a proper meal for herself. Emily would always reply with a smile, though she knew her mother sacrificed everything for her. There was something else Emily couldn't quite explain, a sense that a piece of her life was missing. When schoolmates asked about her father, she gave short answers, pretending not to care. Laura had shared a simple version of the story: her father had left before she was born, without going into details. Emily accepted this explanation but still felt an inexplicable absence, as if she were connected to something she couldn't name. On days when she was alone, Emily would sit on the nearest bench along the main street and play her ukulele to the sounds of the town, the hum of cars, the hurried footsteps of passers-by, the occasional chirp of a bird. These small details inspired her, and she composed melodies that seemed to tell silent stories. A special moment occurred one summer afternoon when an elderly man with white hair stopped to listen to her play. "You have a gift, young lady. This music. Is it yours?" Emily blushed and nodded. "Yes. I made it up. The man smiled, clearly impressed. Don't stop playing. Music like yours can change lives. His words stayed with her, strengthening her resolve. Even so, Emily missed spending more time with Laura. Although she understood her mother's efforts, she couldn't help but feel the loneliness that sometimes surrounded her. Still, she promised herself that she would always make her mother smile whenever they were together because Laura's smile was the most precious gift she could receive. It was an ordinary afternoon in town, the sun shining gently as Emily walked along the main street. She carried her ukulele carefully, looking for the perfect spot to sit and play. She found a shaded bench near a coffee shop and began strumming a calm melody. The sound of the strings blended with the chatter of conversations and the distant hum of passing cars. As she played, two men sat on a nearby bench, their expressions tense as they spoke in hushed tones. Emily kept playing but couldn't help overhearing snippets of their conversation. It's done. The bomb is in place. Now we just wait for the businessmen to get in the car, one of them said. His voice was rough and cold, sending a chill down Emily's spine. Are you sure we should do this? It feels wrong, the other man questioned, his tone nervous and uneasy. Shut up and do what you're paid to do. We don't get paid to ask questions, the first man snapped. Emily felt a shiver run down her spine. For a moment, she stopped playing and slowly lowered her ukulele, afraid to draw attention to herself. She tried to process what she had just heard. A businessman was about to fall victim to an attack, and no one seemed to know. She glanced discreetly at the men. One wore a cap, and the other fidgeted compulsively with a keychain, avoiding eye contact with anyone around them. Both looked wary, but when they glanced at Emily, they relaxed. To them, she was just a poor girl playing music on the street. Emily knew she needed to act quickly. But how could a child possibly save someone? Her heart pounded in her chest as her eyes darted around, searching for something, anything, that could help. Then she saw it, a sleek black car parked along the street. A well-dressed man emerged from the coffee shop, carrying a briefcase. She recognized him as the businessman everyone in town talked about, always referring to him as the rich man from the big city. She realized he was the target. Without thinking, she abandoned her ukulele on the bench and ran toward him. She grabbed his arm, causing the man to turn around abruptly, startled. "What are you doing?" "Let go of me," he said, confused and annoyed. "Please, wait. Don't get in the car," Emily exclaimed, her voice trembling but full of urgency. The man stared at her in disbelief, ready to push her away, but something in her expression stopped him. "What are you talking about?" he asked, now more serious. "I overheard two men. They said there's a bomb in your car. They're waiting for you to get in." For a moment, he froze. His face turned pale, and he glanced at the car as if he could see the bomb hidden inside. After processing her words, he gripped Emily by the shoulders, still in shock. "Are you sure about what you heard?" Emily nodded emphatically. "I swear." They were sitting right there. She pointed to the bench where the two men had been, but they were already gone. Now fully alert, the businessman took a deep breath, trying to control his panic. "All right. Stay with me. Don't leave my side. We'll call the police." He pulled out his phone, his hands trembling as he dialed. Emily stayed close to him, feeling both relieved that she had acted and terrified about what might happen next. While they waited for the police to arrive, the man, who Emily now learned was named John Spencer, sat down beside her on a nearby bench. He was trembling, trying to process everything she had just told him. Emily stayed by his side, quiet but vigilant, still shaken by the gravity of the situation. "You saved my life," John said, finally breaking the silence. His voice was filled with gratitude and disbelief. "If you hadn't warned me..." He couldn't finish the sentence. Emily looked at him with her large, calm eyes, showing a maturity far beyond her years. "I just did what needed to be done," she replied simply. "I couldn't let anything happen to you." John studied her for a moment. She seemed so young and fragile, yet there was something about her demeanor that exuded strength. "And you weren't afraid to come up to me? To tell me something dangerous?" "I was scared," Emily admitted, clutching the ukulele she had retrieved. "But sometimes fear isn't as important as doing what's right." Her words struck him deeply. He tried to steady himself, but his hands were still trembling. "You said you heard the men talking about this. Are they still around?" Emily shook her head. "I don't know. They were sitting right over there," she pointed to the now empty bench, "but they left. I don't think they realized I overheard them." "That's probably for the best," John muttered, his gaze fixed on the car in the distance. His eyes locked on the vehicle as if it were a trap waiting to spring. The two remained together, sharing that moment of uncertainty, until the sound of police sirens shattered the quiet of the street. 2 patrol cars pulled up beside them, and the officers quickly got out. John stood and waved them over, explaining the situation. "There's a bomb in my car." "That's what she told me," he said, pointing to Emily. Despite the tension, he tried to keep his voice steady. The officers wasted no time. They cordoned off the area and called the bomb squad. Throughout the process, Emily stayed close to John, feeling the weight of the moment. He, in turn, looked at her with a mix of admiration and protectiveness. After long minutes of tense waiting, one of the specialists confirmed that there was indeed an explosive device in the car. The bomb was successfully defused, and John felt such immense relief that he had to sit down again. "I should be dead right now," he murmured, looking at Emily with even greater gratitude. "You're not. And that's what matters," she replied, giving him a small smile. With the situation under control and the perpetrators being hunted by the police, John offered to take Emily home. It was already night, and he couldn't bear the thought of leaving the girl alone after everything that had happened. Still shaken, he felt he owed her something far greater than words could convey. On the way, Emily, who had been silent, finally spoke up. "You almost died today. And all because of something that wasn't even your fault." John gave a bittersweet smile, keeping his eyes on the road. Sometimes success attracts the worst in people. But it's hard to grasp how far some will go. He paused, glancing at her in the rearview mirror. "And you, Emily? Are you always out on the streets alone?" "My mom works a lot," she said, gazing out the window. "I know she does her best, but it's just the two of us. We don't have anyone else." A moment of silence followed. John wanted to ask more but didn't want to seem intrusive. Then Emily pulled something from the pocket of her small backpack and handed it to him. It was a photo, worn with age but still clear. "This is my mom," she said with a shy smile. "She's the most amazing person I know." John took the photo, curious. As he looked at the picture, the world seemed to stop. It was Laura. He recognized those eyes, that smile, one that had so often inspired him to be a better person. His fingers trembled as he held the photograph, and a lump formed in his throat. "What's her name?" he managed to ask, his voice barely audible. "Laura. Laura Bennett." The name hit him like a tidal wave. John turned his gaze back to the road, struggling to process what he had just heard. Laura was alive. And this brave, lively girl, could she be his daughter? The shock was so overwhelming that he had to pull the car over. Emily watched him, confused. "Are you okay? What's wrong?" John turned to her, his eyes shimmering with a mix of emotions. "Emily. I knew your mother. A long time ago. She was the love of my life." Emily blinked, surprised. "You knew my mom? But how?" John didn't know how to answer. The weight of the past, the separation, and the lies seemed to crush him at that moment. "It's a long story. But I need to see her. Please, tell me where you live." Emily hesitated for a moment, but something in John's voice made her trust him. She pointed the way, and the car began moving again. John, now with his heart ablaze, felt he was on the brink of revisiting a chapter of his life he never expected to open again. When they arrived in Emily's neighborhood, night had fully set in, and the glow of house lights cast soft shadows on the quiet streets. John parked the car a few meters from Emily's house and called the police station to check on the investigation's progress. The dispatcher informed him that the two suspects had been located and arrested at a motel outside of town. "We've obtained partial confessions, Mr. Spencer," the officer on the other end explained. One of the men revealed that the mastermind behind the plot was your business partner, Richard Morgan. He was unhappy with the profit split and decided to eliminate you. John closed his eyes, feeling the weight of betrayal. Richard was someone he had trusted implicitly, a longtime partner in his business ventures. The thought that he had orchestrated John's murder was almost as devastating as the attempt itself. "And the device in the car?" John asked, trying to stay calm. "It was successfully disarmed, but the technical team confirmed it was set to detonate with the slightest movement of the engine. The girl's warning undoubtedly saved your life." John thanked the officer for the information, ended the call, and looked at Emily, who was watching him intently. They caught the men. And now they know who was behind it. "It seems I owe you my life even more than I thought." Emily shrugged, but there was a glimmer of pride in her eyes. "I just did what was right." John sighed, still trying to process everything. Before stepping out of the car, he crouched to meet Emily's gaze. "Thank you. Truly. And I promise, I'll find a way to repay you for everything you've done for me." Emily smiled, unsure of what to say. Despite her young age, she understood that what she had done that afternoon had changed both their lives forever. As they stepped out of the car and walked toward the house, John's heart raced. Each step brought him closer to the moment he would see Laura again, and his mind was flooded with questions. Did she still remember him? Did she hate him for the past? And most importantly, how would she react to seeing him standing there? Emily carefully opened the gate, and before she could reach the doorknob, the door swung open. Laura stood there, her eyes wide and her face marked with worry. The moment she saw Emily, she ran to her, pulling her into a tight embrace. "Oh my God, where were you? I was so worried." Emily began to explain, but before she could finish, Laura, still holding her daughter's shoulders, looked up and met John's eyes. The moment their gazes locked, time seemed to freeze. Laura's expression shifted from surprise to something deeper, a mix of pain, longing, and disbelief. "John," she whispered, her voice barely audible. John couldn't respond immediately. He simply nodded, his throat tight and his eyes brimming with tears. "Laura. It's me." The silence between John and Laura stretched endlessly. Emily glanced between them, confusion evident on her face as she tried to understand the gravity of the moment. Laura took a hesitant step forward, still clutching the door frame as if she needed it for support. "Is it really you?" she asked, her voice trembling. I thought you were dead." John felt a sharp pang in his chest. He took a step toward her but stopped, respecting the fragile distance between them. "I thought the same about you," he said gently. "All these years, I believed you were. That I had lost you." Laura closed her eyes for a moment, trying to hold back tears. Emily, sensing the tension, lightly touched her mother's arm. "You two know each other?" she asked softly. Laura looked at her daughter, the emotion in her face unmistakable. "Yes, Emily, we know each other. From a long time ago." John took a deep breath, gathering the courage to continue. "Laura, I don't know how this happened, how we ended up so far apart. But seeing you now, after everything, I don't even know where to start." She lowered her head, a tear rolling down her cheek. "I don't know either. It's so overwhelming. I cried for you, John. I cried so much. And then Emily came along. I had to move forward for her." John's gaze shifted to the girl standing beside Laura, his eyes now filled with understanding. "Emily is my daughter, isn't she?" The question hung in the air like an inevitable truth. Laura nodded, unable to speak. John's eyes filled with tears, though this time it was a blend of joy and regret. He knelt to Emily's level and looked into her eyes. "You're amazing, you know that. You saved my life today. And now I realize that, in so many ways, you're the reason I'm still here." Emily gave a shy smile, still processing everything. Laura finally took a step toward John, placing a delicate hand on his shoulder. "I don't know how we're going to handle this. Everything that's happened. But it's good to see you. It's good to know you're alive." John placed his hand over hers, feeling the warmth he had missed for so long. "The only thing that matters now is that we're here. I'm not going anywhere, Laura. I'm not losing you again." After the initial shock of their reunion, Laura invited John inside. He hesitated for a moment, glancing at the modest home where Laura and Emily had built their lives. Sensing his unease, she offered a gentle smile. "It's not the house you dreamed for us, but it was enough to raise Emily." John stepped inside, taking in every detail. The walls were adorned with simple photos of Emily over the years, smiling in different moments. Childlike drawings were displayed in a makeshift frame in the kitchen, and a comforting aroma of herbal tea filled the air. Seated at the kitchen table, with Emily listening attentively, Laura began recounting what had happened after the accident. "I was carried downstream for miles, unconscious. When I woke up in the hospital, my grandmother was there. She's the one who told me you had died. At that moment, my whole world collapsed." John ran his hands over his face, trying to contain his anger and sadness. "She lied to you. She told me you had died too. I left, Laura. I left because I thought there was nothing left for me in that town." Laura nodded, her eyes glistening with emotion. "I understand why she did it. She was scared. Afraid of seeing me suffer more than I already had. I can't blame her, even though it was cruel." "And you? You found out about Emily while you were in the hospital?" John asked, glancing at his daughter. Laura nodded again. "Yes. I found out I was pregnant 2 months after the accident. It was hard, but she gave me a reason to keep going. Even without you, I knew a part of you would be with me forever." John looked at Emily, overwhelmed by a wave of love he had never felt before. "I don't even know how to express how sorry I am for being absent. I should have looked harder. I shouldn't have just accepted what your grandmother said. You did what you could with what you knew, John, Laura replied, her voice gentle. And in the end, what matters is that we're here now. You found Emily. And you found me, too. Emily, who had been quietly listening, finally spoke. I didn't know any of this. I always wanted to know about my dad, but I never asked much because I knew it made my mom sad. John took his daughter's hand, his voice steady. I'm here now, Emily. And I promise, no matter what it takes, I'm going to be a part of your life. Laura looked at John, then at Emily, feeling as though an old wound was beginning to heal. They had a lot to rebuild, but for the first time in years, she felt hopeful. In the months following their reunion, John, Laura, and Emily began to rebuild the bonds that fate had severed. The process wasn't easy. The wounds of the past still ached, and John's adjustment to their new family dynamic required patience. He spent as much time as possible with Emily, helping her with school, watching her musical moments, and occasionally playing clumsy notes on her ukulele. Emily, in turn, seemed to bloom with John's presence. Her shyness gave way to a vibrant enthusiasm, especially when he took her on simple outings to ice cream parlors or parks. John knew he couldn't recover the lost years, but he was determined to create new, meaningful memories. Laura watched it all with a mix of joy and caution. Seeing him with Emily brought her a peace she hadn't felt in years, but she still feared that the scars of the past might haunt them. One night, as Emily slept, she and John sat on the couch, a cup of tea between them. You've really changed, Laura said, looking at him with tenderness. You gave me a reason to change. And now, Emily gives me a reason to keep trying to be better, he replied. Laura took his hand, just as she had in the days when they were young and full of dreams. I know we lost so much, but I think we've gained something even more precious. A second chance. Not long after, John planned a special dinner for them. He cooked, a skill he had learned during his years of solitude. The simple table was decorated with wildflowers he had picked earlier that morning. When Laura and Emily entered the room, he stood, holding something in his hands. It was a small box. He knelt, looking at Laura with a nervous smile. I've spent years dreaming of saying this. Laura Bennett, will you marry me? Laura's eyes filled with tears, and she nodded without hesitation. Yes, John. I will. Emily, jumping with joy, wrapped her arms around both of them at once. The small room filled with laughter, tears, and the promise of a future together. The wedding was a simple yet deeply meaningful celebration. Friends and neighbors gathered in a local garden to witness the moment John and Laura renewed their commitment to one another. Emily, with her ukulele in hand, played a song she had composed especially for the occasion, a melody that spoke of new beginnings and unbreakable love. Over time, John relocated part of his business operations to the town, prioritizing being close to his family. He and Laura turned their house into a warm and welcoming home, filled with laughter and love. Emily continued to thrive, supported by parents who never stopped believing that together they were stronger. Years later, on a sunny afternoon, as they strolled through the park as a family, John looked at Laura and Emily and felt an undeniable truth. Fate had been cruel, but love had guided them back to one another.